Hello, everyone. My name is Kelvin Coleman, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Alliance. Thank you so very much for joining us for today's panel. I guarantee it's going to be a great panel as we continue our celebration of Data Privacy Day. Today's title of this panel, How COVID-19 Has Changed Data Privacy. No surprise at all, COVID has changed so many things about our lives, and certainly, data privacy is one of those things. We have had a wonderful time over the last several months talking about how COVID has changed cybersecurity in general. Well, it's now really time to give some exposure to data privacy, and so very excited to have our panel here to talk about from contact tracing to telework practices. Our panelists will discuss how that privacy landscape has shifted during COVID-19 and what that means for the privacy, for the future of privacy. And with that, I want to get out of the way and get our panelists in here and have them introduce themselves. Brian, let's start with you. Can you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. Thanks, Kelvin, and thanks for having me and looking forward to today's discussion. Everyone, my name is Brian Philbrook, and I'm a lead privacy counsel at OneTrust, the #1 most widely used platform for operationalizing privacy, security, and governance, trusted by over 7,500 organizations around the world. And I serve in a leadership role there on our internal privacy and security program, as well as in a product advisory capacity for the OneTrust platform itself. So again, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Really appreciate that. Melanie, my friend, how about you?
Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to participate. My name is Melanie Unsign, and I'm the founder and CEO of Discernible, which is a communications consultancy dedicated specifically to security, privacy, and risk issues. Prior to founding this company, I was leading security, privacy, and engineering communications for Uber. I come from the cybersecurity side of the house, previously running security communications at AT&T and then later at Facebook. And I also run the press department for DEF CON, which is the world's largest hacker conference. So I do spend quite a bit of time working on the security side and thinking about how that plays and interacts with privacy. And I'm so thrilled to see NCSA continuing their commitment to Data Privacy Day.
Thank you, Melanie. Obviously, you have a lot of time on your hands, so thanks for joining today with everything you have going on. Christopher, let's go to you.
Certainly. Thanks for having me. My name is Christopher Harrell. I'm the CTO of Yubico. We're a Sweden and USA-based company that makes authentication and encryption devices and software that's associated that tries to respect people's privacy while making sure that they don't get tricked online. My previous experiences are from companies like Yahoo and Apple, mostly on the security side of things, but I've been fortunate to be able to venture more into the privacy side of things as we've designed new protocols and gotten them adopted into many browsers and platforms across the world to help not just corporations, but dissidents and journalists, and be part of an organization that takes that very seriously. So I'm very happy.
Christopher, I really appreciate you being here. Lindsey, last but certainly not least, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Calvin. I'm Lindsey Schultz. I'm a privacy counsel at Visa. I've been in financial services for basically my whole legal career, doing a number of things, but privacy was sort of always one of them. And I think, like a lot of counsel who cover privacy, just sort of got really into it and took on more and more, and GDPR kind of blew that world wide open for me. So I'm really, really happy to be here and on this panel.
Thank you so very much. You know, the audience will note that, my God, we couldn't have put together a better panel, just all-star here, all-stars. So really appreciate everyone being here. Lindsey, I'm gonna come back to you with a question to start us off. You know, COVID-19 has changed life as we know it, and you know, the way we work, the way we you know, even view our health. What are some privacy implications that have come about from the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, it certainly wasn't what I thought I would be working on when I started this position. My role is a pretty general one. I do help oversee the global privacy program. But I think once we sort of got over the shock of realizing that, oh, we're not just going to stay home for 2 weeks, we're actually going to stay home for a long time, we had to mobilize in a number of different ways. And so for Visa, we mobilized in two primary ways. One was the employee side, and one was sort of what we can do for the greater economy and for our clients and consumers that use Visa cards. And so on the employee side, like everybody, we started looking at, wow, we have all these processes that involve personal information, and normally we feel relatively protected because, we're doing certain things in the office only, right? So for example, call centers is a perfect example. So how do we pivot things to make sure that that information's still protected, but we have more flexibility? So, kudos to our cyber team really jumping on these initiatives, figuring out, what things needed to be on VPN. And actually, even before we decided that that we were going to be doing this remote thing for a long time, we were starting to test sort of our VPN capacity and all of our protocols around what we can and can't do, and then issuing comms that complement those things. And then as it evolved, we also started working with HR, and because we realized that at some point we need to have some processes for those folks that do need to go in the office, right? And despite that the US doesn't have a federal law and HIPAA did not really apply in this situation, we still had to realize that we were going to be collecting some amount of health information that we normally wouldn't think to collect, right? So, and I think all of us privacy pros who do multinational work have kind of a European focus at this point. So even with the US offices, we started saying, okay, so let's weigh the public interest against the rights and freedoms of the individuals. And so doing that balancing test to collect a minimal amount of information to protect our fellow employees, but not have so much that, it could be potentially an issue or, make anyone uncomfortable. So, and doing that balancing still now with thinking about what vaccines might look like, what contact tracing might look like once we are back in the office. And then I'll just touch briefly on sort of what we did externally, which really required Visa to pivot its thinking more around what the world was looking like in spending. So, our slogan is, we're everywhere you want to be. And a lot of that involves the ubiquity where someone can travel comfortably and still use their Visa cards. Well, what do you do when people aren't traveling and people are now nervous about even touching surfaces? So we really worked with our colleagues to have some really good aggregated data to make sure that we could support better contactless payments, that we could support moves to more digital spending, digital environments, and really make sure that our clients and other stakeholders had insights on the trends in spending so that we could help figure out how to get the economy moving.
Yeah, Melanie, and full disclosure, Visa is a board company and works with the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and we're so excited to have you. And I must admit, we have leaned on some of the things that you've learned and put out there to help others. So we really appreciate that partnership and look forward to following up with you on a couple of your answers here. And Brian, I want to come to you now, and certainly, between contact tracing and vaccine tracking, the public is learning a bit more about how data has the potential to track and curb the spread of the disease. But do you think that the pandemic, has changed the public's attitude towards data privacy? We do know the average consumer is more or less willing to share their health data in exchange for certain benefits. But weigh in on that for a second. Benefits of that against privacy implications.
Yeah. In terms of the public attitude and has it changed? I think without question, people are more aware of privacy issues. On average, people are probably more educated about what those issues are. They're starting to learn about the rights that they have under different laws. I mean, if you just look at your organization, if you talk to the privacy office there, they have most likely seen a pretty significant uptick in the amount of data subject requests that they've received. So requests for deletion, requests for access to their data, opt-outs, all of those different things, pretty significant uptick in those. And I think people are starting to ask the right questions, but there's still a long way to go and more to learn. And I'll kind of use an illustration to sort of make that point, I guess. So there was an article published by the IAPP recently. The Civil Liberties and Privacy Officer at the NSA, her child's school sent her a consent to record classes for operational purposes. And it was just kind of this broad consent that was sent out to all the parents. And so, this parent who obviously works in privacy, that kind of triggered in her mind, well, okay, wait a second. There's obviously some privacy implications here, and it's my duty as a parent and as a citizen to kind of push back a little bit and maybe try and get some answers. So she started a conversation with the school, kind of as that concerned parent and citizen, talked about, what the potential issues were. And then after a lengthy discussion, the school ended up making pretty significant policy changes to how they were going to conduct the recordings and retention requirements and all, these different things. And obviously the teachers, this is uncharted territory for them, so they hadn't even considered privacy implications. And I think that's kind of where we're at. People have gut instincts about some of these things, but it's starting to come from it's an opportunity to sort of hash these things out and learn from them, and kind of grow with that. So.
Yeah, Brian, let me follow up really quickly, because you said something that I think all of us will probably touch on, the fact that the teachers, this wasn't necessarily in their job description when they started, but they're learning so much more about it now. Just really quickly, we've probably seen just transformation of people like educators becoming much more aware of privacy. Is that correct?
I would say so. And not just educators, but I would say even in the for-profit space. So, in the private sector, people beyond the privacy and security office are learning about privacy. It's becoming more core of a core issue to the business. We look at the businesses that we work with, and we're hearing from the sales teams there, the marketing teams. We're hearing from HR. We're hearing from business development, R&D, really across the board. These issues are starting to spread, and people are beginning to think about them, I think, a little more thoughtfully.
Yeah, absolutely. I will apologize to the audience because I'm on a country board for South Carolina. So starting with Lindsey and Brian, I'm like, oh yeah. So if you hear that ambient noise, I apologize. I'm just actively agreeing with them. And that's not going to change, I think, here with Christopher and certainly, Melanie. Christopher, let me ask you a question here. I'm sorry, Melanie, let me come to you. How are companies balancing consumer privacy and consumer safety, Melanie? And what about when legal compliance is a factor? How should companies deal with this intersection?
Sure. Well, I think, as Brian noted, I mean, if we just look at kind of the tracing apps and the different technologies, one of the key things that has come out of COVID-19 is that privacy is definitely winning, even when we compare it to safety considerations. And I think one of the reasons for that, there's actually two key things that I want to focus on here. One is we need to be really mindful of whose privacy and whose safety are we actually talking about when we have these conversations. One of the things that companies often struggle with is considering their most vulnerable populations or marginalized communities, where we'll see something like surveillance technologies that are used in the intent of public safety. But truthfully, the fact that they erode privacy for certain communities and certain individuals has a worse impact on their physical safety, right? And so we need to be mindful of the fact that when we talk about consumer privacy, and we talk about consumer safety, we are not talking about a monolithic group of people. And that is something that a lot of companies struggle with when they are trying to balance how do we do the most good for the most people without leaving behind those who are most vulnerable. The second thing that I want to emphasize is we are seeing an increase in scrutiny and expectations from consumers for that proof from people who are telling them that they need to compromise privacy in order to increase safety. There is a broader movement to call out what we call safety theater, where, you know, if you are asking me to compromise my privacy for the sake of safety, I want to know exactly how that data is going to improve my safety or the safety of my community or my neighbors or my friends and family. And we have seen a really kind of shameful lack of that, both from the company side, but also from the government side, in terms of explaining to consumers how their data and how the balance with privacy does actually lead to safety benefits. There is still a really unhealthy appetite for data from these institutions without really clear use cases or purposes for how that data is going to be used and the safeguards that are going to exist around it. And in regards to the legal compliance, I think it's a little bit more obvious on the privacy side in terms of the regulations that exist and what companies need to do to meet those requirements. But from a safety perspective, there are often legal requirements as well. And one of the things that we saw, particularly globally during the pandemic, was that governments were mandating participation or endorsement of tracing technologies in order to continue operations in their jurisdiction. And so those of us who kind of really sat in the middle of privacy and safety were faced with this decision of, do we go along with what the government is mandating from a public safety perspective, even though we know it is compromising the privacy of every single one of our users? And in that situation, you know, I found it very encouraging to see more and more privacy as well as safety professionals really kind of respectfully push back and try to engage with those government agencies to say, we recognize what you are trying to do. We've got to find a middle ground because, you know, worst case scenario, if all of that data is shared with you, the government agency, even well-intentioned, and there is a compromise of that data, it is us, the company, who will suffer the lack of trust from consumers because we're the ones that collected it. And so, you know, the conversation between privacy and safety really hinges on proving the safety use case and making sure that you're being honest and intellectually honest about what that data is going to be used for, but then also getting really to the heart of whose safety and security are we, privacy and security are we actually talking about, and are we being inclusive, or are we just, you know, playing to the lowest common denominator?
You know, Melanie, thank you so very much for that. And something I had not really thought about when you talked about, you know, looking at safety, security, and the compromise of privacy. I automatically, for some reason, thought about community activists, right, who are bringing these things up. And it seems like you're saying that these groups are so much more sophisticated around the issue of privacy than we perhaps give them credit for. Am I reading you correctly there?
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even something as extreme as being a political activist, but, you know, even if we talk about women's safety, right, where you know, as a woman, sometimes the best thing for my safety is to protect my privacy so that all of this data you're collecting, it can't be exploited by perhaps an abuser or a stalker. And so there are a lot of technologies that we're putting in place to track people, you know, either online or in the physical world. That doesn't necessarily provide more safety for them. And again, it's that crutch and that addiction that we have in some of these industries to provide safety theater rather than actually being honest about whether or not people are truly safer as a result of those privacy invasive technologies.
Wow, that's really something. Lindsey, I want to come back to you and follow up on a similar question concerning, and so, yeah, I termed it community activists, and these other people were more sophisticated, and Melanie certainly corrected me there. But I want to come back to you in a minute and talk about consumers themselves. Are they becoming much more sophisticated in understanding privacy and issues around that? And you touched on it a bit, but I'd like to hear more. But Christopher, let me go to you really quickly. Over recent years, we've been looking closely at emerging privacy regulations like GDPR, and we were talking about it in our pre-panel discussion here, and CCPA. How has COVID impacted these regulations?
It's funny. I think Melanie mentioned a lot of the knee-jerk reaction of, hey, we have a circumstance, a dangerous situation. I think many countries have even declared states of emergency or words similar to that in order to create mandates or additional powers. I think the work that's being done by the European Council on how this affects human rights is very, very interesting. You know, the UN has a Declaration of Universal Human Rights that's pretty broad and mentions privacy specifically, and they've been doing a lot of great writing recently about how COVID has these kinds of trade-offs where the kinds of information you're collecting must be necessary. You know, the protection must be adequate. The term of the storage must be limited, which is very difficult in digital systems that we're using today for these things. And then likewise, that they must only be used for the purposes for which they're collected. For me, you know, I've been following the laws on this for a long time, and being from the United States and watching things change over the years. You know, Sweden here, I didn't know, had a Data Protection Act in 1973. And then, you know, much later, we had a lot of activity in the US and the EU in the 90s and the 2000s around child privacy, and then general data privacy. And then GDPR gave it some teeth, which was great to see some regulating bodies actually go after the things that were being done that were not appropriate. But it's very challenging, I think. The policy, the things that you're supposed to do, and the technology oftentimes don't intersect, because there hasn't been a lot of work in that space that's made it into the public eye, or, you know, stood the test of something like, you know, contact tracing. So a lot of this work was done last minute. We didn't have good models for it. We didn't know if it would be effective, if the trade-offs were reasonable. So I think, to me, two real answers to your question. One is that on the technology side of things, I think we're behind the policy side of things, and that makes it very hard, because people will say things with, I think, as either Lindsey or Melanie said, with the best of intentions. Nobody is looking to do bad stuff here. They're trying to protect people. They're trying to protect their citizens. They're trying to make sure that people stay healthy and are safe. But it's very, very hard to ensure that that happens. So I hope the technology can catch up. There's been a lot of work on that. That's changed a lot. I think the second thing also ties into consumer awareness, which I think Brian was talking about. Many people who previously, there's this common mantra of, you know, I've got nothing to hide, so privacy is not important to me, which is a very dangerous way of thinking. I think that people who were otherwise healthy and weren't thinking a lot about how things might impact them are now kind of forced to. They have context that they didn't have before. Context about, oh, somebody's going to look at who I'm associating with, or health information, or, you know, maybe somebody's not fully following the law and this is something new to them, like they haven't been forced into that situation before. So I think context and technology are the things that I'm seeing as trailing where the privacy policy people are today, and I hope we can catch up on that. I think the consumers are definitely concerned, but they're also scared. So the way that you say things to people is very important. The set of options available to them is very important, and I hope we can get better at that in the future.
Well, you know, Christopher, we certainly at the National Cybersecurity Alliance believe in that education and awareness pieces, which is why we, you know, spearhead Data Privacy Day. So thank you very much for, you know, stressing that point. And Lindsey, again, I want to pivot just a bit, because, you know, Visa is an international brand, you know, everywhere. Are you seeing sophistication among consumers? You know, is that going up a bit as it relates to privacy, and you know, asking more questions around privacy and how perhaps companies are dealing with protecting information?
I'm not sure I can answer whether Visa's seeing more of that, primarily because despite our hugely prominent brand, most of our interactions with consumers are sort of removed because our our issuers and our banks are the ones that have those relationships. But I can tell you that there's a lot more focus on sort of what we're doing with our responsibilities as such a large company with such a large network, to show consumers, what they can do and what we can empower them to do. And so I would say just across the board, I think COVID has in fact made a lot of people that I've talked to, whether professionally or not, more aware of what's going on digitally. And actually, I'll take this a little bit of a different direction. I think because people are spending more time online and watching TV, they're actually thinking more about this and thinking in a more sophisticated way about it. Because the kinds of questions that I get from even friends now are very different than they were, say, a year and a half ago. And so, when I talk to even a friend about, oh, actually, you can ask XYZ company for your information and they should be providing it to you. There's light bulbs going off. There's a lot more focus on, oh gosh, maybe I do want to see this information. And then on the company side, obviously, a lot of conversations about, we need better processes. We need to show what we can do and show how we're, really taking this to the next level.
Yeah. Thank you, Lindsey. That was exactly what I was looking for. I really appreciate that. And in fact, I'll follow up. Before COVID and you visit friends in their homes, I'd love to visit friends who had just purchased a new, TV. I say, oh, what's your privacy setting on your television? They look at me like I'm crazy, right? Like, what are you talking about? Of course, go to settings. Of course, go to privacy. Of course, they're like, what in the world? So yeah, I'm a bit of a party pooper in that way. Didn't get invited back much. And with that, we're going to end with everyone, of course, predictions, right? What kind of predictions do you have as privacy experts for privacy practices and even legislation as a result of COVID-19? Bottom line, where do we go from here? And Brian, I'll start with you, my friend.
Sure. So, some of the points that were raised that really got me thinking, and we touched on them in the prep call as well. This dichotomy of safety and privacy is going to be a continued conversation. We know that, and even if you look at it on a personal level, if you really want to drive it home, you can put a 24/7 monitored security system in your home. You can have cameras and microphones in every room and sensors, and you'll be very safe. You'll be much safer. But you'll be giving up a lot of privacy. And that's kind of the discussion that we obviously need to have as a nation and as a world, globally. After World War II, at least in the EU, there was a strong move towards privacy. And I think that was a decision that was born out of great wisdom there. There was an agreement that privacy is a fundamental right, codified in legislation. And now the EU has the most comprehensive set of privacy laws in the world in the GDPR. And to Melanie's point with that dichotomy, after 9/11, on the other hand of things, there was a reaction and move towards extreme safety, which arguably resulted out of fear. The Patriot Act spiraled out of control, ending in mass surveillance of U.S. citizens and the Snowden revelation. So, it's a conversation that has to happen. It's happening right now. But I would expect there to be more legislation to be proposed and eventually passed here in the U.S. We're going to see it at the state level. It's happening now. That patchwork could eventually get unbearable, though, to the point where a federal law is necessary in order to kind of consolidate everything. So I'm expecting to see that. And then I would expect to see much more litigation around the right to privacy and what the boundaries are and what that balance is in today's connected world. And I think that's a good thing. Let's agree and then disagree, and then let's hash it out and find out what the answers are.
Thank you. That's a great answer, Melanie. I'm gonna come to you next. And Brian, as you talked about, the cameras in the house and more security, potentially less privacy. Melanie, our mutual friend Ruby Zeffo at Uber has this great picture, slide of the Pope in the Pope mobile, surrounded by his security, and very secure but throngs of people around him, right, in this glass box. Very secure, not surprising. So I thought about that immediately, Brian, when you described that. Melanie, let's go to you. Let's give us some predictions.
Sure. So it's interesting because obviously in my former position at Uber, we were constantly talking about privacy and safety. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time researching was the efficacy of security cameras. And the body of research that is available, including from law enforcement, is that cameras do diddly squat to prevent crime. Where cameras are most helpful is for investigations after the fact. And so again, this is where we get into like safety theater and being honest with consumers and constituents about what the actual benefits are from a safety perspective in exchange for those privacy concessions. And you know, one of the things that I expect to see moving forward, simply because so many of these tracing apps that were developed by governments were such abysmal failures, both in terms of actually properly working as software, but then also adoption, is that I think a lot of governments have learned that software development is something that they have underinvested in. They do not know how to build secure software or even working software. And so I expect to see if there is a next time around for any type of government software application that requires similar privacy trade-offs, we're going to see more involvement from technical experts, more technical reviews, more technical documentation. Because we saw in these places where the app either didn't function properly or was full of security and privacy vulnerabilities, people didn't trust it. And we're not going to be able to increase trust with just our words. People are really tired of paper promises and privacy policies and you know, similar documents are not convincing to consumers. And so I think we're going to see a lot more investment in technical integrity and development from these government agencies the next time they try to take something up of this magnitude.
Well, you know, I'm going to start incorporating security theater in my talking points. I think that, and I'll, of course, you know, tell them where I got it from, you, Melanie. But I think that's such a great point. So thank you for sharing that. Christopher, let's go to you next. Give me some predictions.
Well, they say the hardest thing to predict is the future, but I'll offer some hope. My aspirations and what I'm looking forward to. I think even in my bio on at least one thing, I talk a lot about trying to challenge what I believe is often a false dichotomy between security and privacy, or safety and privacy, as we're talking about here. And that's not to say that it's easy. The naive implementations of things that we talked about earlier, people's hunger for data, and you know, the easy way to do that is just to hoover it all up as much as you can and make it as widely available to people as possible in the hopes of generating some value, whether it be at the originally intended purpose or some derivative purpose. But I truly believe, and you know, part of my thinking here is colored by the fact that I'm now working for a company that built a new authentication protocol that basically solves the phishing issue while respecting people's privacy. That was not easy. So hard engineering work can make some of this better. I think there's been a lot of work in differential privacy recently. So I'll lean back on the technical side of things, where I hope that we continue to see unification of policies which are understandable. We continue to see user education, and then we continue to see additional enforcement. But you know, Melanie said this a moment ago, there have already been countries that promised data used for COVID tracing would be used only for that purpose, and we've seen it abused by law enforcement in that country already. So my hope is we can build solutions that make that sort of stuff at least detectable, and preferably detectable by the people who are giving up the data in the first place, and that those policies and the oversight and the enforcement arms can all catch up and work together. But we've got a long way to go. I think this is fairly nascent. I've been hearing and using security theater for a long time, but I've actually never heard safety theater until this time. And I don't want to discount how important it is for people to feel safe, But marketing is a brutal thing, right? You don't buy surveillance systems normally as a consumer. You buy security cameras that provide surveillance, not security, as we talked about. So I hope that we can get there. I have to believe that's what makes me want to keep coming to work every day.
Yeah. You know, well, three things you touched on. We always talk about the National Cybersecurity Alliance. Anything dealing with technology, even, you know, especially privacy, you got to talk about products as well. And you touched on that, processes and people. You touched on all three, Christopher, so that's great. Lindsey, we're going to let you close out on the predictions. What do you think? Give us some insight into the future.
Well, I wish I had true insight, but I think a couple things came to mind as we were speaking, and actually right on the process technology and a people component. I really, really would love to see more companies making more strategic decisions about what their privacy program looks like, regardless of what the law says. I think that's the right way to move, and it's pretty much the refrain that I have been echoing for a while now. And I would love for COVID to kind of have tipped us more in that direction as people are more focused on privacy issues. Because I think one of the most disheartening things that I often discuss internally, just out of no fault of anyone's, but you know, when I have someone say, "Oh, well, do I have to do this? Is it, you know, will I go to jail if I do this? You know, or if I don't do this, right?" And really, that's just the wrong way to think, right? I mean, people are so much more focused on what's happening with their data than they used to be. So I'd love to see companies just making more of those kind of policy-based decisions as the laws attempt to catch up. And I guess just the second thing that I would really love to see, which could happen as a result of some of the COVID issues, is more focus on when companies have to share data with the government and what exceptions may exist, because I know Schrems really brought that to light in the US. And the US, I think, you know, we're used to erring on the side of sharing data with the government. I think the issue with Apple and Google sort of determining whether or not they were going to do that is ended up kind of being the downfall of their efforts on the contact tracing. So I would just love more clarity in that direction.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so very much for that, Lindsey. I think we've had a very full panel. I really do. You know, we could go on this topic for at least easily another hour or two and have a lot to talk about. But in the interest of time, we'll end it there. Brian, Melanie, Christopher, Lindsey, can't thank you enough for joining with us at the National Cybersecurity Alliance to again bring recognition to Data Privacy Day. And audience, we really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon.